let's talk about, I don't know whether it's right to say elephant in the room, but because it's not that. Everyone's talking about it. The term that has been most used probably over the past 50 days is war crimes.
Yeah.
And that what Israel has been committing incessantly against Gaza, and we'll come to the West Bank later on, but Gaza specifically, has been described as being war crimes by even those who proclaim themselves to be Zionists. Not only Jews, but Zionists, people who have relatives in Israel, people who say, we believe in the idea of Israel. However, we cannot overlook the fact that what the Netanyahu regime, the IDF, the Israeli state is committing is, a series of war crimes.
Well, I think when you use the term elephant in the room, and I think it is because if we were looking at any other conflict, if we were looking at any other situation in the world, and we have to understand that the Israel-Palestine is probably the most talked about conflict, certainly that I've ever encountered. I mean, I remember writing articles for Al Jazeera several years ago on a number of different topics, and each would have a readership of in the low thousands. But whenever it was about Israel and Palestine, it was in the tens of thousands. Yeah. And so it does show. But I think the elephant in the room is because of the situation with Israel, and I've repeated the phrase a number of times in the last couple of weeks, is that if we were talking about anywhere else in the world, we would not even be having this conversation, or at least the conversation would be very, very different. And I think that's perhaps why it is the elephant in the room. It is looked upon very, very differently. But you're quite right when you say that, we may not have been, or we may not have had such a wide audience calling out war crimes being committed in 2006, 2008, 2014, at different times throughout the conflict, the long-standing conflict. But we are seeing that now because of the scale of the atrocities, because of the devastation of Gaza, and now what we're seeing in West Bank as well, but also because of the language which is being used by not only Israeli politicians, but politicians in the West. Yeah. And I think that has changed, and that has caused a great deal of concern for those that would ordinarily not speak out, because it is now making things very, very difficult for Jews in this country, for Muslims in this country, across Europe, and it is the language as well as the action which is creating that environment.
You're a man of law. You have a catalogue of experiences with the ICC, with How is it that all of a sudden we're hearing about statements regarding the intentions and the actions being carried out? I mean, when, for instance, you have Israeli officials stating to the world that they intend to cut off food, water, medicine, essential supplies from a civilian population under siege for 17 years, the size of around 2.5 million, yet then qualify that by saying, according to international law. The thing is that in the past, in my experience at least, I recall when these acts were hidden, they were denied. These atrocities, these violations were denied. But now you have politicians, some of whom, in the case of the leader of our opposition, for instance, lawyers and people who should have legal expertise, actually stating things that, a first-year law degree student would understand would be violations of international law, yet then go on to somehow qualify that as international law. What's concern?
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but what I would say is when you look at those, and one statement in particular was from, I believe it was from our immigration minister, who had said that all of the action that was being carried out was in accordance with international humanitarian law.
Yeah.
I think my response to that was he really needs to read international humanitarian law to understand it.
I mean, the thing that struck me was, in the world of politics, politicians sway like a pendulum, according to interests, according to their whims, desires, whatever it is, okay? In the world of finance and business, people deal and wheel and, cheat and deceive and the such for whatever gains they wish to take. But the one solid thing that we have is law. That's one solid thing. That's something that no one can play with. That's something that no one can interfere with, can change or alter or modify according to how they feel, the wind is blowing that particular day. But the fact that these people, some of whom have legal backgrounds, can actually say these things and then add, according to international law, it concerns me greatly that we are now on the threshold of seeing even the law being abused in the way that politics, economics, security or the such are being played with or have been played with.
I think it boils down to a lack of enforceability. So laws are only as good as the enforcement mechanism that you have in place. So when there is the sense that there is no enforceability of those laws, that there is no mechanism to deal with it, there's no political will to ensure that the laws that we hold dear are when we see that there are no consequences as a result of breaching those principles, then the whole system becomes meaningless. But I think your point where you have politicians with a legal background actually coming out saying, because that's what people will listen to, that's what the general public will listen to, because we're generally dealing with fairly complex areas of law. I mean, the basic principles are fairly straightforward. You don't kill civilians, you don't bomb hospitals, you don't bomb schools, you don't bomb refugee centres. By the same token, you don't take hostages, civilian hostages, and use them as bargaining tools. So all of those are fairly basic principles of law. But when you see the response to the 7th of October, the consequences that we've seen of that, for a leading politician in this country, even the leader of the opposition, to come out and say that's in accordance with international law, well, the general public will say, well, that's okay then.
Yeah.
What they're doing must be okay because our leading politicians have said it's in accordance with international law. But it's not. I mean, when you look at who I would consider to be leading experts on these very, very principles, I mean, there are two in particular, two leading international legal scholars, Mark Kirsten, who's affiliated to Guernica, and Kevin John Heller, who's on Twitter, pretty much constantly talking about these issues. These are the people that are actually setting out what are the breaches that we're seeing and what should be the consequences of those. We had one of the statements that has been repeated more than any other is the right of self-defense, that Israel has the right to defend itself. Yeah. Yes, it does under the UN Charter. But if we go back to the decision which became known as the Wall case at the International Court of Justice, which obviously Israel still has not implemented, it was very clearly stated that as an occupying power, it doesn't have the right to rely on self-defense in respect of those in the areas of which they are occupying. So by the very same token, legal scholars recognize, reputable legal scholars have come out and said that Israel doesn't have the right to rely on self-defense in this way. And even if it did, the actions that it takes still have to be proportionate. And they are not. And so when we would expect our leading politicians to be able to draw a fine line between what it can do under international law and what it can't, unfortunately, it just gives a blanket statement saying it's justified under international law. And we're expected to just accept that.
And you see, the thing is, I mean, you speak as clear as day. I mean, it's fine. What you're saying makes absolute sense. It's unequivocal. It's there's no room for ambiguity. It's quite clear that the issue that we have is that because of this lack of enforceability, it is becoming more and more of a conviction is that the international law has no teeth. It's there as a statement, probably a statement of intent, probably something to sort of look at and say, well, we haven't entirely lost our humanity because, this is the law. But in actual fact, because it fails to, time and time again, I mean, we can go back to, a few years ago, Syria, for instance, which is an ongoing violation of sorts, and various other cases, whether it be the Rohingya, for instance, whether it be the Uyghurs, whether it be, and you say, okay, so what's the use of this? I mean, okay, so it's there, and there are countless students around the world studying this, graduating as experts. But ultimately speaking, when crimes, where violations of that particular law happen and occur before our very eyes, it's not something that's reported. It's something that everyone is seeing. It's something that those same perpetrators are admitting. I mean, they're not saying that they're not attacking a hospital in Gaza. They're saying they're attacking it because they have, a certain motive. But that doesn't alter the law, that attacking hospitals and civilian installations is a violation of international law. The danger here is that people start losing confidence and trust in international law. Is it not?
I think it is. And I think it's a very worrying time for all of us. Because I think you also have to look at a conflict like we're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank, not only in terms of what we're seeing now, but what is going to come next.
Yeah.
And I think if we don't have the courage to stand up and take action now, that is very clearly going to affect the way the next conflict is fought. Because it boils down to the lack of consequences. And I think that the situation in Palestine is a perfect example. Because we can be critical of the International Criminal Court, but when we look at Yemen, when we look at Syria, when we look at Uyghur, these are situations where the ICC has no or very limited jurisdiction.
Because they're not signatories to the Roma Declaration.
That's right. And I mean, with Syria, we're still fighting with the International Criminal Court to open an investigation as far as the forced deportation by using the situation that the previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, used in the forced deportation of, at that point, 500,000 Rohingya from Myanmar into Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is a state party, whereas Myanmar is not. It's a crime that occurs on the territory of two states, and one of them is a state party. So the International Criminal Court ruled that there is jurisdiction to deal with that. So we then argued the same must apply for Syrians forced into Jordan, because Jordan is a state party. But take that aside, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction for everything which is happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and by the same token, has jurisdiction for what happened on the 7th of October with Hamas fighters. So I think that it's reasonable to be critical when insufficient action is being taken when there is jurisdiction, but I don't think it is as justified to argue when they don't have jurisdiction. But this is a situation where clearly a lot more could be done.
But you agree that the crisis, the international community, international order is facing right now is the crisis of credibility.
It is.
Of whether the United Nations works, of whether the Security Council is justified, whether the ICC, for instance, is actually doing what it was expected by nations around the world to do.
Well, I mean, break that down into 2 points. So, we've only got to go back in history to look at the League of Nations and why the League of Nations effectively collapsed and the United Nations was born because of the very same issues that we're looking at now as far as the United Nations is concerned. And I think that one of the issues that we have with the United Nations is that lack of enforceability. I mean, it's all well and good making political statements, but unless they're actually backed up with concrete action, it effectively it is ineffective. And the Security Council needs to be fundamentally reformed, because when you have the veto power of one of the permanent members, and you can see that at least a number of those 5 are actively committing international crimes or actively supporting, aiding and abetting international crimes, and yet they have the power to veto any resolution. I mean, that has to change. By the same token, the criticisms that we make of the International Criminal Court, what I would say is, yes, there is justification for some of that criticism, but at the same time, it is not solely the International Criminal Court that is responsible for its inability to act in the way it should. Look at al-Bashir as an example. Yes. He was indicted. We were unable to get him before the International Criminal Court. That's not the fault of the International Criminal Court. Right. That's the fault of particularly states parties that where...
So it's down to the political will.
It is, and state cooperation. So, and to give you an example, having been involved with Bangladesh since 2010, again, another situation that should be at the International Criminal Court, we hope will be one day at the International Criminal Court. There was a memo that recorded a conversation that Sheikh Hasina had, I believe it was around 2014, 2015, when I was much more involved. And it was, I believe it was when Ban Ki-moon was Secretary General. And so there had been a number of threats made, if you don't do this, these are the consequences. And the conversation was by Sheikh Hasina saying, they can't even stop the conflict in Syria. What the hell are they going to do to us? Wow. They have no power.
Wow.
So when you have that kind of environment and that, dictators and autocrats around the world believe that there are no consequences to what they do, then that is a time when we have to rethink the international criminal justice system and the international legal order.
Let me take you back to something you said at the top, and that is something that falls under this mystery to many, including myself, and that is Israeli exceptionalism. That when you're talking about Israel, it's not like you're talking about any other state that commits international crimes. I mean, you mentioned Bangladesh. We all know about Syria, for instance. But in the case of Israel, this has been ongoing now for decades. And the violations of UN resolutions, including, for instance, you mentioned the wall. I mean, that's just one very, very clear aspect which Israel is in violation of every single day, simply because it fails to abide by international law on that particular thing. Why is it, in your view, as a legal expert, as someone who knows about these cases even from a political perspective, why is it that Israel has this standing, so that not only is it able to get away with committing these crimes, but actually enjoys the support the succor and the collaboration of, very powerful states around the world, including ours, as well as the United States, of course. Why is that, in your view?
I wish I had an answer to that. I don't have an answer. Certainly not an effective answer to that. I think one of the reasons has been that there is a deep-rooted confusion between criticizing the Israeli government and their policies and anti-Semitism. And I think that the moment you criticize the Israeli state for their policies, and I'm not talking about abolition, I'm just talking about criticizing them for their policies and for their actions in Palestine, then immediately they're shot down. That there must be an ulterior motive for that. And it's not always the case. It is sometimes the case, yes, I accept that, but it's not always the case. If you look back to the statement by the current UN Secretary General, Gutierrez, when he said these tragic events of 7th of October, and then he went on to say it didn't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
He was immediately...
Which is fairly sensible.
Well, it's a statement that a lot of people have said. I mean, there can be no justification for the acts that were carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October, and I don't think anyone would support that. But by the very same token, you have to understand the context in which they have occurred. Again, that's not justifying them, that's providing a context, and then looking at the response to that. It's justified to comment on that. But unfortunately, what we see frequently, and we've seen it in the last couple of weeks playing out in the tabloids here, we've seen it on TV, we've seen it even in the House of Commons, is that kind of approach is not justified, even carrying a Palestinian flag. Our previous Home Secretary and thankfully our former Home Secretary wanted to outlaw a demonstration for carrying a Palestinian flag. And as we saw, the event that got so much attention, the violence that we saw was not through the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. It was through the right-wing extremists, the real extremists. So, again, I can't provide any real answer for why.
I wouldn't be wrong in saying that there is a clear special status that Israel enjoys in terms of what it does, in terms of what it says, in terms of how it violates international law. I mean, had it been any other state that would do the same, I mean, the entire world would rightly come down on it like a ton of bricks.
Well, if you look at the, two other causes that I'm very much behind. I mean, if you look at the Syrian pro-revolution demonstrations we had in this country, when you look at the Iranian opposition and the more recent demonstrations for women's rights in Iran, you don't see the same level of criticism of those demonstrations. Even when there is active involvement by the Iranian state and the Syrian state, you don't see the same kind of response in relation to those. And the situation, as I said at the outset, is that the situation that we're looking at here is put into a different category. And if it was occurring anywhere else, we would not see the same level of repression of those fundamental rights. But we do. We do constantly.
Let's imagine for a second that you, Toby Cadman, head of Guernica 37, you had a big say as to what should happen. From the legal point of view, politics, we could speak to political circles, but from a legal perspective, what do you think should be done in regards with what has been happening for the past 53, 54 days?
Well, certainly the position has to be taken that those who are responsible for what occurred on the 7th of October should be identified, charged and prosecuted, where the evidence demonstrates that they're responsible, and those who are responsible for what has happened subsequent to that. In Gaza, where we're looking at upwards of 15,000 deaths now, those that are responsible, both from a political and military leadership, need to be held accountable. And by that I mean arrested, charged, and prosecuted. Because unless you...
By whom?
By the International Criminal Court. And if the International Criminal Court is not willing to do that, then we have to ensure, as we've seen with the Syrian cases, that charges are brought against individuals outside, whether it's in Germany, France, United Kingdom, wherever that may be. We have to use the existing laws to do that. But ideally, because we have to also be quite realistic that no Israeli official is going to travel to this country, be arrested and put on trial for war crimes. Yeah. Unfortunately, we know that. Either they're not going to travel, or they're going to be traveling under diplomatic
immunity,
special mission diplomatic immunity. So we saw that a previous attempt to prosecute a Israeli official resulted in a change of the law, so that you now need Attorney General consent to obtain an arrest warrant. So we have to take that into account. I think we have to do whatever we can to ensure that happens. By the same token, we have to ensure that the prosecutor and the court in The Hague are given sufficient resources to do the job properly, and not to expect arrest warrants to be issued next week, because it takes time. Yeah. But we need to see that things are actually moving forward. I would like to see the prosecutor and his team given access to Gaza. I would like to see them given access to investigate the crimes that are occurring in the West Bank. Because going back again to Karim Khan, the current prosecutor, his predecessor, she had announced towards the end of her term of office that this was a matter which was under investigation. And I would say, finally, I would like to see the kind of response to the situation, the kind of international support that we saw for Ukraine. Because Ukraine showed us what we can do when we want to do it. And who would have believed a year ago, 2 years ago, that a British prosecutor at the International Criminal Court would have the courage to issue an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin? But that's exactly what we saw. So is there any justification for not issuing an arrest warrant against Netanyahu or other senior officials? No, there's not. I mean, there's no justification for it. If the evidence is there, and we believe it is, then action has to follow.
Tell me about Syria, because, I mean, your chambers has been heavily involved in the case of Syria for now, 10 years? Yeah. Where are we with that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say that Guernica was built on Syria. I mean, it was Syria work that brought together certainly my partner and I, Al Medina, working on different areas of the Syrian conflict. So it's always been a very, very important part of what we do. We've obviously been active in documenting, working with civil society and working on a number of different strategies as far as having an accountability mechanism, some sense of accountability. And obviously what we've seen in Germany and France is incredibly important. A number of officials have been convicted.
Law.
And then we have the introduction of the Caesar law. And so, there have been important initiatives. Our authorities have been very, very slow in taking the initiative as far as some of these cases are concerned, but we are confident that we will be seeing more happening over the next 12 to 24 months. We are working with them on a couple of investigations at the moment, so we're hopeful that things will proceed.
Do you think that for people listening or watching this, should they have hope in seeing people being prosecuted for crimes committed, for instance, in Syria? In Yemen, for instance, another place where crimes were committed?
Well, I think as far as Syria is concerned, certainly one of the most important initiatives that we've been working on that is starting to bear fruit. So we've been working with the Dutch government in supporting their legal team in bringing a case to the International Court of Justice against Syria alongside Canada for breaches of the Torture Convention. And that's not an individual, it's not individual responsibility, it's not a criminal case. It's state responsibility for breaching the Torture Convention. And so just 2 weeks ago, we had a decision handed down by the International Court of Justice, which was a decision on provisional measures that set out a number of orders to Syria. Of course, the full hearing will not be heard for probably at least another 12 months, but it was an important step in holding Syria accountable in an international court, particularly when we're looking at a time of talks of normalization, which obviously to the Syrian community is deeply offensive, that Assad can simply just go back to the Arab League and start to engage with the international community. And so this is very important. We as I mentioned, we also worked with the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in relation to the crime of forced deportation. And we have a number of other cases against individuals. We had been working on and still working on the case against Asma al-Assad, who a British citizen as well as a Syrian national, for her involvement in atrocity crimes, particularly in relation to chemical weapons. And so that work will continue. It's very, very difficult to have a sense that there will be the level of accountability that the Syrian victim community deserves. But I think we have to continue to push, and we have to continue to be hopeful that there will be a sense of justice for Syrian victims. But I think also the one thing that we have to think about, and the same goes for the situation in Yemen, is that it is largely going to be the future generation of Syrian lawyers who are going to be responsible for holding their predecessors accountable. And in that way, we've worked with a number of Syrian groups in developing mechanisms that effectively can be implanted into Syria when ultimately the Assad regime falls, and it will fall. I'm confident of that. And we have to hope that there will be a new democratic system that emerges in places like Syria and Yemen. We have to believe that.
When you talk about Yemen, who are we prosecuting here?
So the investigations that we've looked at are primarily the Saudi-led coalitions.
Can you do that?
Well, you can. Of course you can, yes. Right. So there are Saudi officials, Emirati officials who are responsible. The coalition is wider than just Saudi Arabia and the UAE, of course. There are other states that can also be held responsible. So there are those states that have provided diplomatic support. There are those that have provided military support, logistical support. I mean, they're all part of what we would say a joint criminal enterprise, and so arguably they can be prosecuted. So we have presented evidence to the Metropolitan Police here. We've presented to the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. But what it requires in this particular case is a slightly more courageous approach, because it would be extending the boundaries of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, and we're not unaware of how difficult a task that is. But again, we have to understand that these things do not occur overnight. They take a very, very long time to.
How? I mean. Obviously, from the legal standpoint, And the thing that you just mentioned regarding the future generation of Syrian lawyers, do you find that we have sufficient numbers, capacities, aptitudes, calibers of future lawyers who are willing to get involved in this area of law, which sounds to me like it's not the most, let's say, affluent and the most rich in terms of legal channels, yet it's probably in our lifetime the most important line of law. Do you find that there are sufficient numbers, calibers, capacities and aptitudes of next generation of people who will be interested in what's happening in Bangladesh, who will be interested in, going after the Assad regime, as difficult as that may be, or Yemen, as difficult as that may be?
Yes. Put simply, I think, yes, there are sufficient numbers, particularly as far as Syria is concerned. I mean, the lawyers that I've met over the last few years working on Syria are some of the best lawyers I've worked with anywhere in the world. And so, and the level of dedication and commitment to justice is what's important. So I remember a podcast that we did a couple of years ago now when we first started, the Guernica Accountability podcast, and I did one episode on Syria. And one of those that I interviewed was an extraordinary woman, Altikriti. Actually, I just attended the premiere of her latest documentary last night, which was, I would have to say, the second most extraordinary thing I've seen, because the first one was her first film. Yeah. And she truly is an incredible person. But what was striking when I asked the question at the end of every interview, what does justice, what does accountability mean to you? And she gave me quite an extraordinary answer because she'd never seen it before. And to many Syrians who had never experienced a system of justice in their own country, in their own lifetime, having that and seeing what it is for those that have been forced into the refugee communities around Europe and have seen what it means in Germany, what it means in France, what it means here, what it means in the Netherlands, having never seen that before, having a legal training, but having no system of independent justice whatsoever, I think it's made them all the more determined to learn and build that for themselves. And so I think that they are well suited. The young generation of Syrians. I mean, you look at Ibrahim Olabi in my chambers. I mean, extraordinary individual for what he's done at such a young age. And that's what we need to build on. There is always a danger of what we call the brain drain, is that when you have a conflict, Bosnia being the perfect example of that. I have a very, very close affinity to Bosnia, as you know, and still spend a lot of time there and have a great deal of friends in this country, very, very educated, very, very successful professionals. But they leave, and that's the problem. One of the situations that we're working on right now and have been working with the Attorney General in the Gambia. I mean, the Gambia being the country that brought on, that took the initiative to take Myanmar to the International Court of Justice. Yeah. They have their own issues that they have to deal with back home. Sure. And one of the difficulties is getting those Gambians who fled during the dictatorship, who are lawyers, who are judges, to come back and to work within their system to help solve their problems.
Essentially, why? Do they give up? Is it too arduous? Is it too... Why do they leave?
Well, I think you have a stream that leave because of the conflict. You have individuals like my wife that lived through the siege of Sarajevo that was forced out by her family for her own safety. So you have those, and then they're educated in the West. They have opportunities given to them in the West that they don't necessarily have in their own countries. And so some of them do return, but they see there's not been a great deal of development. The system of government hasn't matured, and they don't see that they have the same opportunities that they have outside, whether it's in the West, wherever it might be. And so you have that sort of that second phase.
Also conceivably be quite dangerous also.
Absolutely.
I mean, you and I worked on Iraq, for instance.
Yeah.
And one of the things you recall when you were advising human rights activists and organizations was about collecting information and collecting data.
Yeah.
And that was, which seems like the most natural, ordinary, sensible thing to start off with. Yeah. But that was in itself a huge stumbling block, because they said, well, first of all, victims are too afraid of coming forward.
Yeah.
And then if they do come forward, risking the lives of the rest of the families, you can't get that notified or accredited, because the official who will put their signature on that particular affidavit or statement will be exposing themselves and potentially coming into harm's way as a result of being part of this. So,
right.
So you have the physical danger that obviously is felt by these people.
Absolutely. I mean, just in the nature of the work, I mean, we've had lawyers that we work with in different jurisdictions that have been arrested, tortured, some killed, disappeared. I myself have been subjected to this in two separate countries, having been detained and deported from Bangladesh, and then followed when we met with lawyers in Malaysia, receiving death threats, even last week receiving death threats because of the work that we do on Bangladesh. The same, the one time that I've ever been to Palestine, when I went to East Jerusalem, I was detained at Tel Aviv airport for 5-6 hours and interrogated because I'm a human rights lawyer. And
it's a badge of honor, by the way.
Well, there is that, but I mean, the difference is that I was subjected to this treatment, terrifying treatment. Being shown photographs of my family, saying that I should have thought about them before I travelled, which I've never really spoken much about. But it suddenly occurred to me, I'm a white British barrister, and I get subjected to that treatment. What on earth would I be subjected to, if I was Palestinian and working on documentation of war crimes? Yeah. You have to think about that, and so it is a very, very dangerous task. We know, for example, one of the, or I would say two of the areas that have been highly problematic is the investigations into Libya, and also investigations into the UAE, and having attended events in this country where people have spoken out, and that there will be people monitoring those events, and it's terrifying for young activists who are involved in this area of work. It's not for the faint-hearted at all. I love what I do, but I sit in a level of comfort and luxury that those that come from those conflicts do not have.
It's something that really boggles the mind. The fact that we can sit here and talk for hours about the catalogue of cases around the world where there are violations, where there are crimes being committed, where there are often states or state-sponsored, and at the cost of horrendous, numbers of human lives, and incredible damage to livelihoods. This area of law, which I find incredibly instrumental, it sort of strikes me how difficult it must be for you to speak to someone, a law student, who's about to choose their path and to select which. I mean, how do you talk them into choosing this as their career? It's not that you're telling them about how much money they can make or how many cars they can possess or how big a house that they can own. It's about the kind of threats that they will face, the kind of disturbance to family life and domestic life, the dangers that become not only on them but their staff and their clients
and their families.
And it's just, I don't know, it's ridiculous. How do you do that? How do you convince someone that, by the way, this is a good choice that if you were to make?
It's a difficult one to answer. I would say you don't have to convince people to do this kind of work because the kind of people who come to talk to you about this kind of work have already made the decision that this is what they want to do.
Yeah.
And I think people who enter this for a particular reason. And it could be for a whole host of reasons. I guess the question that I'm asked more is how and why did I get involved with this kind of work? And unfortunately, most people are slightly disappointed when I tell them that I sort of fell into it rather than actively chose it. I think circumstances were such that I was sort of pushed into this area.
At what stage was this?
At the beginning, right at the beginning. So the first placement I had was in Bosnia. So I had done other things before I became a lawyer, and so I graduated in 2001, and then in 2002, early 2002, I went to Bosnia, primarily because I'd been there a couple of times already. I got married in '99. My wife being from Bosnia, we made the stupid decision not to get her family over for our wedding. So we went there later that year, which would have been the end of '99, which was during my legal studies. And so I was very interested at that time. And then I had a chance meeting at Cumberland Lodge, which is one of the royal lodges here, when I was training to be a barrister for an advocacy training weekend, and happened to meet an extraordinary barrister who's now a judge, Silvia de Bertadano, who now sits, I think, in Leicester or Birmingham. And she had been involved with the first case at the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia. Her husband was a prosecutor in East Timor, and so we just started talking. And it just, to me, sounded fascinating. And so I decided I was just going to apply for a short internship to do an international, just a couple of months, really. Yeah. And I remember having a discussion with my wife when she said, if we're going to go to any post-war country, we're going to go to my post-war country. And so I decided to do a 3-month secondment. And I was very, very fortunate that I'd never met her before, but I contacted Cherie Blair and asked for some help, and she actually got me some help with some funding to actually do the work. And so what was supposed to be 3, a maximum of 6 months, ended up being 8.5, 9 years. And because by that point, I'd then become head of the international support section for war crimes at the Bosnian prosecutor's office, when I came back and joined chambers here, had no real intention to continue with war crimes, but the first group of lawyers that came knocking on my door were from Bangladesh. And then Bangladesh led to Syria, Syria led to Yemen, Yemen led to everything else that we do now. So, and then Guernica was created.
When you mention war crimes, you would think, I mean, as a layman myself, in terms of law and legal issues, but you'd think that they are very, very few and far between. They happen once every generation or something, because they are so horrendous and they are so flagrant.
They used to.
It's incredible how we look around us and we can, easily.
It's everywhere.
It's
everywhere, and we didn't used to have this. Maybe we did. We just didn't know. because we're obviously in the age of information, and so maybe we know more about what's going on now than we did before. And with social media, we see in real time what's actually happening, whereas maybe we didn't before. I'm not sure if that's even true, but I think going back to sort of one of the first points I made, where it's the lack of accountability or a vacuum of accountability and lack of enforceability is why we're seeing it so much more often. And I think if you go back to the Trump administration, and if you look at what the Trump administration did,
which, by the way, we may still end up having another in a year's time.
I think it's almost certain that we will, which is terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying. But if we look at that time and we look at when Trump effectively allowed a de facto head of state to order the execution of one of his critics in a European Turkey embassy, and then we subsequently saw him sanctioning the prosecutor and judges at the International Criminal Court because they had the gall to investigate American atrocities in Afghanistan. That has given a free rein, a green card to any dictator, any autocrat, to effectively decimate its opposition, and that is the reality, unfortunately. And I think that's why we're seeing so much more now than ever before. I think that's why we're seeing the level of atrocities that we're seeing in Gaza right now is because of the protection of the United States and to some extent the United Kingdom in ensuring that there will be no accountability for those actions. So I think we will, unless there is a change in the way that we approach justice and accountability, I think we will see an increase, not a decrease, in the level of atrocities that we're seeing now.
The United Kingdom government, if you were to offer a grade of how good or otherwise it is in terms of international law, its standing, its support, its endorsement, its promotion of international law, how would you rank it?
I don't think it even goes above 0.
Really? Really? Why? How?
We've had, I tend not to get involved with political discussions as far as this country is concerned, particularly now, because I consider it just to be an embarrassment right now. But when we have a government that has effectively said in Parliament that it's fine with breaching international law. There are almost like there are different levels of international law that you can breach, and that we were even considering now withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights in order to salvage a ridiculous agreement with Rwanda. I don't see. Even before we get to that, we have the unfortunate and ridiculous nature of Brexit. We then have a successive change of leadership in the Conservative Party that seems to get lower each time it changes, and now what we're stuck with, the fact that they are quite happy to breach international law, whereas we were, one of the main founding states for many of these treaties.
I have to say, I never expected you to say 0. I thought maybe 5 out of 10. But you've just brought to mind when one of our senior officials spoke and said, if ever we are hindered by either European Court of Human Rights or any other, then we need to just basically go over their heads. We need to circumvent any kind of human rights or whatever hindrance it is to us implementing our policies. That is fairly horrendous, I have to say.
Let's look back at what the Prime Minister said immediately following the ruling by the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, on the Rwanda decision.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with that decision or not, the Prime Minister came out and said, and I won't quote him because I don't remember verbatim his words, but he effectively said that we will not be bound by a foreign court. I mean, somebody needs to remind him that the Supreme Court is not a foreign court, it's our court, and it's applying English law.
Yeah.
And the European Convention on Human Rights is a part of English law. And so what he now wants to change, and we're now finally seeing other states criticizing, particularly Biden, because it has the risk of derailing the Good Friday Agreement. So, it has significant consequences. Yeah. I don't know where that's going to end. I mean, I would hope that I hope that this is going to force an election early next year. I really do. Because there has to be a change. We cannot continue like this.
It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Toby, thank you very much.